March 15, 1881. The morning reveille echoes across Fort Apache like it has every morning for the past decade. But today, something different hangs in the desert air. Something that will challenge everything the United States Cavalry thinks it knows about horses, warfare, and the very nature of superiority itself. Picture this scene, if you will. Captain James Morrison stands in the pale Arizona dawn, watching his magnificent cavalry horses stamp and snort in their perfectly aligned ranks. These are not just any horses, these are Kentucky thoroughbreds, the cream of American breeding, standing 16 hands high with coats that gleam like polished mahogany in the early light. Morrison runs his weathered hand along the neck of his personal mount, Thunderbolt, $800 of pure equine power, winner of racing trophies from Virginia to Texas. The captain's chest swells with pride as he surveys his command 200 of the finest cavalry horses ever assembled on the frontier, each one worth more than most men earn in 3 years. Morrison himself is no greenhorn. This is a man who led charges at Gettysburg, who felt the earth shake under thousands of hooves as the Army of the Potomac swept across Pennsylvania farmland. He knows horses like a violinist knows his instrument, and what he sees before him represents the pinnacle of military horseflesh animals. Bred for power, speed, and endurance, fed 14 pounds of imported grain daily, groomed to perfection, and trained to respond to the slightest pressure of knee or rein. But then, just as the sun clears the eastern mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, they arrive. The Apache scouts, and with them comes, well, let me put it this way. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when worlds collide, when two completely different philosophies of what a horse should be meet face to face, this is your moment. The Chiricahua Apache ponies that pick their way into Fort Apache look like they belong in a children's picture book next to the cavalry giants. Standing barely 13 hands high, that's a full 3 hands shorter than the cavalry mounts. These spotted and painted ponies appear almost comically small. Sergeant Willem McMahon, a gruff Irishman who's seen action from the Civil War to the Indian Wars, actually chuckles out loud. "Sweet Mother of God," he mutters to his companions. They look like oversized dogs with long ears. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, fresh from West Point with his head full of military theory and European cavalry doctrine, shakes his head in disbelief. Hayes represents the new generation of American officers, educated, scientific, convinced that modern military thinking has solved all the ancient problems of warfare. Looking at these Apache ponies, he can't help but wonder aloud to his fellow officers. Do they ride those creatures? Because they simply cannot afford real horses. The laughter ripples through the cavalry ranks like wind through wheat. These soldiers, after all, represent the most powerful military force on the continent. Each of their mounts cost more than a frontier family's annual income. Each horse consumes resources that could feed an Apache family for months. The mathematics seem obvious. Overwhelming, even bigger is better. More expensive is superior. Civilized breeding trumps primitive selection. But watch Nietzsche carefully. The son of the great Cochise sits his spotted pony with a dignity that seems to emanate from somewhere deeper than mere horsemanship. There's something in his posture, something in the way his hands rest easily on his mount's neck, that suggests he knows something these laughing soldiers do not. His pony, a mare he calls Ghostwind, stands perfectly still despite the commotion around her, ears swiveling independently as she monitors her environment with an alertness that seems almost supernatural. This little mare, you see, comes from a bloodline that stretches back 3 centuries to horses that escaped from Coronado's expedition in 1540. For 300 years, Apache horsemasters like Naiche's grandmother, Dos Terce, have been selecting breeding pairs not through scientific charts or studbook records, but through dreams, observation, and an understanding of desert survival that makes European horse breeding look like child's play. While cavalry doctrine demands that horses be broken, that's the word they use. Broken Apache children grow up sleeping beside their ponies, sharing the same food and water, developing relationships that blur the line between human and animal consciousness. Ghostwind knows the scent of water from 2 miles away. She can survive for days on nothing but prickly pear pads and mesquite beans. She can navigate through absolute darkness over terrain that would cripple those magnificent thoroughbreds in broad daylight. The cultural chasm here runs deeper than anyone in that fort can imagine. The cavalry sees horses as equipment, expensive, powerful equipment, but equipment nonetheless. Something to be maintained, directed, controlled. The Apache see their ponies as partners, as extensions of their own souls, as beings who share not just their physical space but their spiritual journey through a landscape that demands cooperation rather than domination. But this morning, as the desert wind carries the scent of creosote and sage across the parade ground, none of that matters to Captain Morrison and his men. What matters is that word has just arrived from the telegraph office. Geronimo's band has been spotted moving north through the Chiricahua Mountains. The great Apache leader, the man who has made a mockery of American military power for over a decade, is on the move again. Morrison can barely contain his excitement. "Gentlemen," he announces to his assembled officers, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who has never doubted the superiority of American military might, "we're going to catch these renegades on their circus ponies before the sun sets tonight." The economics of the chase seem overwhelmingly in favor of the United States cavalry. Each trooper's horse cost $150 and can gallop at 35 miles per hour. The Apache ponies cost nothing, literally nothing, eat whatever grows in the desert, and top out at perhaps 25 miles per hour. The cavalry horses are shod with the finest iron shoes, carry the most modern military saddles, and are supported by a supply chain that stretches back to the industrial might of the eastern United States. What Morrison's West Point training never taught him, what no military academy in the world could have taught him, was that desert warfare measures victory not in speed but in endurance, not in power but in adaptation, not in the ability to dominate the environment, but in the wisdom to become one with it. As 200 cavalrymen prepare to thunder out of Fort Apache in pursuit of 30 Apache warriors, the stage is set for one of military history's most humbling lessons. A lesson that will echo through the decades, changing not just how the American military thinks about horses, but how it thinks about the very nature of warfare itself. The desert is about to teach the United States cavalry a lesson it will never forget. And somewhere in the distance, barely visible as dots against the vast landscape, Geronimo and his people move through their homeland with the quiet confidence of those who understand that the greatest victories are won not through overwhelming force, but through perfect adaptation to the demands of an unforgiving world. What happens next will redefine everything these soldiers think they know about horses, about warfare, and about the thin line between civilization and survival in the American West. Dawn breaks blood red over the Chiricahua Mountains, and the sound that pierces the morning air is one that has struck fear into the hearts of America's enemies for decades, the cavalry bugle sounding the charge. But today, in this God-forsaken corner of Arizona territory, that bugle call is about to become something else entirely. Today, it becomes the overture to one of the most spectacular military disasters in American frontier history. Picture Morrison's cavalry as it explodes from Fort Apache in textbook formation. This is what West Point dreams are made of: 200 horsemen thundering across the desert in perfect alignment, sabers gleaming, carbines ready, the very embodiment of American military might. The first hours seem to vindicate every assumption these men have ever held about warfare, about horses, about the natural superiority of civilization over savagery. The powerful cavalry horses devour the ground beneath them with mechanical precision. Each stride covers more territory than an Apache pony can manage, and the distance between hunter and hunted closes with mathematical certainty. Young Lieutenant Hayes feels his heart surge with something approaching religious ecstasy as his thoroughbred emperor stretches into a ground-eating gallop that would have won races at Saratoga. The Apache ponies are visible now as tiny dots scrambling up a distant ridge, like ants fleeing a boot. The weight advantage seems insurmountable, and Hayes takes comfort in the mathematics of military superiority. Each cavalryman carries saber, carbine, ammunition, field rations, and full kit, totaling 240 pounds, yet their grain-fed horses power forward without apparent strain. This is what happens when industrial civilization meets Stone Age primitiveness, science and breeding triumph over superstition and accident. But Geronimo. Ah, Geronimo. Here's a man who has been fighting the white man's army longer than some of these soldiers have been alive. He knows these mountains like a mother knows her child's heartbeat, and he's chosen his route with the kind of generational wisdom that no military academy can teach. He's leading his pursuers into the volcanic Badlands, where his people learned desert survival not from textbooks, but from the horse spirits themselves, through ceremonies and visions and 3 centuries of hard-won experience. As the morning temperatures climb past 90 degrees Fahrenheit, something begins to shift in this chase. The first signs are subtle, a stumble here, a missed step there. But watch carefully, because what's happening is nothing less than the collision between 2 completely different philosophies of what it means to survive in the American desert. Cavalry horses, bred for Kentucky's gentle meadows and Virginia's rolling hills, begin stumbling on volcanic rock that Apache ponies navigate like dancers. Think about this for a moment. These are rocks formed by volcanic eruptions, sharp as broken glass, twisted into formations that can slice through horseshoe and hoof alike. The Apache ponies, with their naturally worn hooves, smooth and hard as granite from a lifetime of desert travel, find purchase where iron horseshoes spark and slip and slide. But it's not just the terrain. As the sun climbs higher, as temperatures soar past 100 degrees, the real catastrophe begins to unfold. Emperor, Hayes's pride and joy, his $800 guarantee of military supremacy, begins to foam pink at the mouth. That's blood, by the way. That's the sound of a horse's body generating heat faster than the desert air can cool it, faster than evolution ever intended any horse to generate heat. Meanwhile, something almost magical is happening with the Apache ponies. Their riders guide them through patches of shade that seem invisible to cavalry eyes, shade cast by rocks and cacti and arroyos that the Apache know like the lines on their own palms. They pause for seconds at hidden seeps where horses can wet their muzzles, tiny water sources that would take a cavalry patrol days to find even if they knew to look for them. And then there's Lozan. If you don't know about Lozan, you should. She's Geronimo's warrior woman, riding her medicine pony Kandazistlishishen, a name that roughly translates to the one who knows the way. This pony carries not only Lozan's 120 pounds, but something far more valuable. Sacred knowledge of which cacti hold moisture, which rocks collect dew, which arroyos hide ephemeral pools that exist for hours after brief desert storms. The Apache ponies employ cooling techniques that seem to defy everything the cavalry knows about horses. They know how to find the microscopic sources of water in this landscape, how to extract moisture from plants that would poison a thoroughbred, how to regulate their body temperature through behaviors learned over generations of desert survival. By noon, with temperatures reaching 110 degrees in the shade, and there is precious little shade, the apocalypse begins in earnest. The first cavalry horse collapses, its eyes rolling white with heat exhaustion, its massive body simply unable to cope with conditions it was never designed to endure. Then another. Then another. Morrison watches through his field glasses as Apache ponies pick their way through a grove of organ pipe cacti, their riders casual as Sunday visitors to a park, while his own magnificent horses begin to die around him. The mathematics he was so confident about this morning now work against him with brutal efficiency. Each cavalry horse burns 20,000 calories daily, but receives only half that in grain rations. Each Apache pony extracts 5,000 calories from desert plants while burning only 8,000 in their supremely efficient movement. As the second cavalry horse goes down, Hayes leads Emperor on foot, the great stallion's head hanging low, ribs beginning to show through his once glossy coat. Beside him, Sergeant McMahon, the same man who yesterday mocked the dog ponies, openly weeps as he puts down his Irish hunter with his service revolver. This was the horse that carried him through 5 years of frontier service, through campaigns against the Lakota and the Cheyenne, and now it dies in the desert like something broken and discarded. Morrison faces a terrible realization as he watches his European military doctrine die one magnificent horse at a time in the American desert. Everything he learned at West Point, every principle of cavalry warfare drummed into him during the Civil War, every assumption about the relationship between superior breeding and military success, all of it crumbling under the relentless Arizona sun. The pursuit stretches past 50 miles, then 60, entering regions where military maps show only blank spaces marked unexplored. But this is not unexplored country to Nietzsche and his people. Every water pocket, every game trail, every sheltered canyon is encoded in songs that teach young Apache to read the land through their ponies' senses. And the Apache demonstrate something that will be studied in military academies for decades to come: tactical brilliance that has nothing to do with superior firepower or numbers. They split into smaller groups, forcing the cavalry to divide their already weakened forces, then reunite at predetermined points their ponies can reach, but exhausted cavalry horses cannot. It's like watching chess played on a continental scale, except one side knows the board, and the other side is stumbling blind through terrain that becomes more hostile with every passing hour. At mile 68, something happens that will echo through military history. Morrison's own mount, Thunderbolt, the $800 champion, the horse that carried him safely through a dozen frontier campaigns, simply stops. No amount of spurring moves him. No threat or encouragement can convince him to take another step. His great heart has given everything it had to give. Captain Morrison stands in the killing heat, watching the dust of Apache ponies disappear over yet another ridge, and speaks words that will be remembered long after his bones bleach white in the desert. "Gentlemen, we are beaten." The 70-mile chase enters legend immediately. Apache children will learn it as the long run of laughter, a story told around winter fires for generations to come. But American military academies will study it as Morrison's Folly, a textbook example of how technological superiority means absolutely nothing without environmental adaptation, how the finest equipment in the world becomes worthless when deployed by people who don't understand the rules of the game they're trying to play. What Morrison and his men learned that day in the Arizona desert was a lesson that every great empire eventually learns, usually too late, that there's a difference between being powerful and being wise, between having the best equipment and knowing how to use it, between conquering a landscape and understanding it. But the story doesn't end with Morrison's humiliation. Oh no, what happens next will change American military thinking in ways that reach all the way to our present day. Because sometimes, just sometimes, getting beaten teaches you more than winning ever could. The second day dawns with a scene that would have been unthinkable just 48 hours earlier. 17 cavalry horses, 17 magnificent specimens of American breeding, worth collectively more than most frontier towns, lie dead or abandoned along a trail that now marks one of the most expensive military disasters in frontier history. We're talking about assets worth $25,000 in 1881 money. In today's terms, that's more than $500,000 in horseflesh destroyed by nothing more than hubris and environmental ignorance. Captain Morrison stands in the pre-dawn darkness, his face aged 10 years overnight, watching through field glasses as Apache ponies pick their way through a grove of organ pipe cacti with the casual confidence of creatures who belong in this landscape. Their riders pause periodically, letting their mounts browse on vegetation that would kill a Kentucky thoroughbred within hours. It's a scene that drives home the brutal mathematics of desert survival with absolute clarity. Think about what Morrison is witnessing. Each cavalry horse burns 20,000 calories daily just to maintain their massive frames in this heat. They're receiving only half that in grain rations, grain that has to be transported hundreds of miles across hostile territory at enormous expense. Meanwhile, these Apache ponies are extracting 5,000 calories from plants that grow wild in the desert, burning only 8,000 calories in their supremely efficient movement through terrain they've known since birth. Lieutenant Hayes leads Emperor on foot now, and if you want to understand the complete reversal of everything these soldiers believed about military superiority, look at this young officer. Yesterday he was the embodiment of West Point confidence, convinced that superior breeding and military science would triumph over primitive savagery. Today, he's a broken man leading a broken horse through a landscape that has stripped away every illusion he ever held about warfare. Emperor's head hangs low, his once magnificent coat dull with sweat and dust, his ribs beginning to show through skin that yesterday gleamed like polished mahogany. This is an $800 horse, a winner of racing trophies from Virginia to Texas, reduced to a shambling wreck by terrain and conditions his breeding never prepared him to face. Beside Hayes, Sergeant McMahon, the gruff Irishman who just yesterday was joking about Apache dog ponies, openly weeps as he performs one of the hardest duties any cavalry soldier ever faces. He draws his service revolver and puts down his Irish hunter, the horse that carried him through 5 years of frontier campaigns, through battles with the Lakota and Cheyenne, through a dozen skirmishes that forged him into one of the finest non-commissioned officers on the frontier. But this is more than just the death of individual horses. What's dying here is an entire worldview, a complete system of beliefs about military superiority and technological advantage. The pursuit has stretched past 50 miles, then 60, entering regions where official military maps show only blank spaces marked unexplored territory or Indian lands. But this isn't unexplored country to the Apache. Every canyon, every water source, every hidden trail is encoded in tribal memory going back centuries. Nietzsche knows every water pocket in these lands because his father taught him and his father learned from his father before him, knowledge passed down through generations in songs that teach young Apache warriors to read the landscape through their ponies' senses. This isn't just navigation, it's a form of spiritual communion with the land that no military academy could ever teach, no European military tradition could ever understand. The Apache demonstrate tactical brilliance that will be studied in war colleges for decades to come. They split into smaller groups, forcing Morrison's already weakened cavalry to divide their forces even further. Then they reunite at predetermined points that their ponies can reach but exhausted cavalry horses cannot. It's like watching a master chess player toy with a beginner, except the board is several hundred square miles of the most hostile terrain on the North American continent. Picture this scene. Apache warriors pausing at a hidden spring that bubbles up between two boulders, invisible unless you know exactly where to look. Their ponies drink deeply while the riders fill water vessels and wet their mounts' necks and flanks. 2 miles away, cavalry horses are dying of dehydration while their riders desperately search for water that might as well be on the moon for all the good it does them. At mile 68, the inevitable happens. Morrison's own mount, Thunderbolt, $800 of pure cavalry perfection, a horse that has carried him safely through campaigns from the Civil War to the Indian Wars, simply stops. Not from injury, not from lameness, but from complete and utter exhaustion. His great heart has given everything it had to give, and there is nothing left. No amount of spurring moves him. No threats or encouragement can convince him to take another step. This magnificent animal, bred for power and speed and endurance, stands trembling in the desert heat. His breathing labored, his eyes glazed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from pushing a living creature beyond the limits of its design. Morrison stands beside his fallen mount, watching the dust of Apache ponies disappear over yet another ridge, and faces the moment that will define the rest of his military career. The words he speaks will be recorded in military histories and repeated in war colleges. Gentlemen, we are beaten. Not defeated by superior firepower, not outmaneuvered by better tactics, but simply worn down by an environment and an enemy that understood something fundamental about survival that all his West Point training never taught him. The 70-mile chase enters legend on both sides of the conflict, but with very different meanings. Apache children learn it as the long run of laughter, a story told around winter fires for generations, celebrating not just military victory, but the vindication of traditional knowledge over the arrogance of technological superiority. It becomes part of the oral tradition that teaches young Apache about the importance of living in harmony with the land rather than trying to dominate it. But in American military academies, the chase is studied as Morrison's folly, a textbook example of how technological superiority means nothing without environmental adaptation. It becomes required reading for officers studying desert warfare, a case study in how the finest equipment in the world becomes worthless when deployed by people who don't understand the fundamental rules of the environment they're operating in. The mathematics of the disaster are sobering enough to change military thinking immediately. 43 cavalry horses, worth $64,000 lost in a single operation. That's not just a tactical defeat, it's a financial catastrophe that forces military planners to question everything they thought they knew about frontier warfare. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. The defeat doesn't just change tactics or equipment procurement. It forces the United States military to confront something much more fundamental: the possibility that there are forms of knowledge, ways of understanding the world, that can't be learned in classrooms or acquired through technology. Sometimes the people you're fighting know something you don't, and sometimes that knowledge is worth more than all the firepower and superior breeding in the world. The trail of dead horses stretching across 70 miles of Arizona desert becomes a monument to military hubris, but it also becomes the beginning of a new kind of wisdom. What happens next will show whether the United States Army is capable of learning from its mistakes, or whether pride and prejudice will prevent it from recognizing the value of the knowledge that just humiliated its finest cavalry. The aftermath of the 70-mile humiliation transforms American military thinking with a speed that would shock anyone who understands how slowly military bureaucracies usually adapt to new realities. Within 6 months, War Department contracts begin specifying desert-tested mounts rather than simply cavalry horses. Congressional hearings reveal the true cost of Morrison's folly: 43 cavalry horses worth $64,000 lost to save face against ponies that cost absolutely nothing to acquire, train, or maintain. This is the moment when reality crashes head-on into military doctrine, and for once, just once, reality wins. General George Crook, taking command of the Department of Arizona, makes a decision that sends shockwaves through the entire American military establishment. He immediately begins recruiting Apache scouts with their own mounts, openly acknowledging that centuries of desert horse wisdom cannot be replaced by military doctrine written for European battlefields. It's like watching the entire edifice of American military superiority crack open to admit a truth that should have been obvious from the beginning. Sometimes the people you're fighting know something you desperately need to learn. Young officers like Hayes, forever changed by watching Emperor die in the desert heat, become reformers, advocating for lighter equipment, local breeding programs, and most radically of all, actually learning from Apache horse culture instead of dismissing it as primitive superstition. Hayes writes in his memoirs, published decades later, "I went into that desert convinced of our superiority in all things. I came out knowing that wisdom and breeding are not the same thing, and that survival belongs to those who understand the land, not those who try to conquer it." But here's where the story takes a tragic turn that echoes through our present day. Victory in war often brings its own kind of defeat, and the systematic destruction of Apache horse culture after Geronimo's surrender in 1886 represents one of the most short-sighted policies in American history. Government Indian agents, believing they're helping Apache families transition to civilized life, begin providing what they call proper horses to replace the ponies that supposedly symbolize Apache backwardness. These well-meaning bureaucrats watch in complete confusion as expensive horses shipped from eastern breeding farms sicken and die on the reservations, while Apache families mourn their confiscated ponies like lost relatives. What the agents don't understand, what they can't understand, really, given their cultural blinders, is that they're not just taking away horses. They're destroying centuries of accumulated knowledge about desert survival, breaking up bloodlines that stretch back to animals that escaped from Coronado's expedition 340 years earlier. These horses carry genetic adaptations for desert survival that no modern breeding program could replicate, even if it tried. But Apache horse wisdom doesn't die easily. Dos Tercer, keeper of the old breeding knowledge and grandmother to some of the greatest Apache horse masters, hides 3 pregnant mares in secret canyons known only to her family. These mares, carrying bloodlines that trace back to the horses that humiliated Morrison's cavalry, become symbols of cultural resistance more powerful than any weapon. For decades, these hidden horses live in canyons so remote that government agents never find them. Dos Tercer's descendants maintain them through the darkest years of Apache confinement, passing down not just breeding knowledge, but the spiritual understanding that these animals represent the survival of Apache identity itself. And here's where our story reaches into the present day in ways that would astonish Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Hayes. Modern Apache horsemen like Timothy Antone are using DNA analysis technology. Those frontier soldiers could never have imagined to identify remnant bloodlines scattered across the Southwest. They're discovering that horses dismissed by government agents as worthless scrubs actually carry genetic markers of the ponies that once made fools of the world's most powerful cavalry. Modern endurance racers, those athletes who push horses and riders across 100-mile courses through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, study Apache training techniques with the intensity of graduate students. They're finding that horses conditioned with indigenous methods consistently outperform those prepared with conventional European techniques. The same knowledge that Geronimo's warriors used to survive in the desert is helping modern competitors win races that test the absolute limits of equine endurance. In the White Mountain Apache Museum, a new exhibit tells this story from both perspectives, pairing Captain Morrison's journals with Apache oral histories of the chase. Visitors can read Morrison's increasingly desperate dispatches alongside traditional songs that celebrate the long run of laughter. It's a remarkable example of how history looks completely different depending on which side of the story you're hearing. The exhibit includes DNA charts showing how Apache horse bloodlines connect to modern Mustang populations, proving that the genetic legacy of those desert ponies survives in ways that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of cultural suppression. Some of the horses that visitors can see grazing in the museum's demonstration pastures are direct descendants of animals that ran circles around Morrison's cavalry. But the last word in this story belongs to Narcissus Gayton, great-granddaughter of the warrior woman Lozan, who trains horses today using songs her ancestors sang to prepare for war against the United States Army. "They laughed at our small ponies," she says, brushing the coat of a mare whose bloodline stretches back 4 centuries. "But the desert taught them what we always knew: it is not the size of the horse, but the size of its heart that crosses impossible distances." Think about that for a moment. The same knowledge that humiliated American military power in 1881 is being used today to train horses for endurance competitions, for therapeutic riding programs, for conservation efforts that are restoring native horse populations across the American West. The wisdom that Morrison dismissed as primitive superstition has become the foundation for modern understanding of sustainable horse management in arid environments. The story of Morrison's 70-mile humiliation is more than just a frontier tale of military disaster. It's a parable about the dangers of cultural arrogance, about the difference between having the best equipment and knowing how to use it, about the way indigenous knowledge often contains solutions to problems that technological superiority can't solve. In our modern world, where we face environmental challenges that seem to require entirely new ways of thinking, the Apache ponies of 1881 offer a lesson that reaches far beyond horse breeding or military tactics. They remind us that wisdom often wears humble clothes, that the most important knowledge sometimes belongs to the people we're too proud to listen to, and that survival in a harsh world belongs not to the strongest or the fastest, but to those who understand the rules of the game they're actually playing. The ghost ponies of the Chiricahua Mountains taught the United States Army a lesson about humility that echoes through American military thinking to this day. Perhaps, in our own time of environmental crisis and cultural upheaval, we might want to listen more carefully to what they're still trying to teach us.